What I didn't say stayed longer than expected, and most of the time I didn't even realize it was still with me. Not loudly, not urgently, just quietly enough to linger. There was no moment where I decided to keep it inside. No clear reason, no single conversation that forced the silence. It wasn't one sentence. It wasn't one confession. It wasn't one missed opportunity. It was smaller than that. It was quieter than that. It was subtle. It was consistent. It was patient. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. I spoke when I needed to. I answered when someone asked. I smiled when it made sense. Nothing about me looked unfinished, and yet there were words I never released, not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly enough to remain. I noticed it in the spaces after conversations ended, the second where I could have added something more, the pause where honesty hovered but didn't land, the moment where something real rose up and settled back down without being spoken. Those moments didn't feel heavy, not painful, not urgent, just present. I was still engaged, still responsive, but something inside me stayed unsaid. Thoughts came and went, but not all of them left. Some stayed quieter, some stayed unfinished, some stayed suspended. I could move through an entire day and still feel a sentence lingering underneath it. Nothing felt wrong, nothing felt urgent. It was more like a quiet echo, as if I had left something behind in a room and walked away without noticing. Everything around me stayed the same, but the way I carried silence had shifted. I paid attention to how normal I still looked. I nodded at the right moments. I laughed when it was expected. I asked the kinds of questions people like to hear. If someone had asked what I was thinking, I would have answered without hesitation, and the answer would have sounded complete. That was the strange part, because inside something unfinished remained, but it didn't ask to be corrected. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was something quieter, a feeling that what I didn't say had its own place inside me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. I tried to treat it like nothing. I kept moving, kept talking, kept letting conversations unfold, but the silence followed. I noticed it in repetition. The same people, the same settings, the same familiar exchanges, everything recognizable, yet slightly layered with something missing. Not empty, not distant, just accompanied by something unspoken, as if I was present in the room, but part of me had stayed quiet on purpose. I didn't fight it. I didn't force myself to go back and say more. I only noticed that something had remained, and that awareness changed something. Because once you realize you left something unsaid, you begin to feel its quiet presence everywhere. Everything continued as usual. Time moved forward. People spoke. The world kept its rhythm, and I moved within it, aware that silence had its own weight. I noticed it in my own reactions, not in what I showed, but in what lingered afterward. I could leave a conversation and realize later that a sentence had stayed behind with me, like my voice had moved on while something inside me had paused. I noticed it when I looked back on my own day. The schedule made sense. The tasks were ordinary. The conversations were familiar, but I felt slightly accompanied by something I had not expressed. Not heavy, just present. As if I had learned how to continue speaking while still holding something back. Even simple moments felt different. What to say, what to leave alone, what to keep inside. None of it felt dramatic. It just felt unfinished. I had to choose what to release instead of assuming everything would fade. And that awareness was new. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revelation. It was quiet. And because it was quiet, it was easy to overlook. But it kept returning. in the same calm way, at the same moments, as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge what I hadn't said. I started to notice how often I assumed silence erased things. A clear ending, a clear closure, a clear sense that the moment had passed. When it didn't, I didn't panic. I just carried it. And that quiet remainder changed the texture of everything. Not the events, not the people, just the way I moved through them and the way I left them. I didn't explain it to anyone. There was nothing to explain. But I carried what I didn't say with me, quietly, through the same rooms and the same hours, aware that it had not disappeared. There was nothing to fix, no obvious problem to solve, no clear reason to revisit. The silence didn't feel urgent. It didn't demand correction. It simply stayed. It moved with me in small ways, in the pauses between thoughts, in the quiet after laughter faded, in the stillness before sleep. I let the days continue without trying to retrieve it. I didn't force myself to reopen the moment. I didn't try to reshape the memory. I didn't try to rewrite what had already passed. I let it remain there, quietly, as something that did not need repair. Sometimes I forgot it was there, and then I would notice it again. Not as guilt, not as tension, but as presence. The strange thing was how normal everything still looked. People still spoke the same way. My routine still held together. My life still moved forward. Nothing outside of me suggested that anything had been left behind. And yet, something inside me remained quietly unfinished, as if a part of my voice was still holding a sentence that never reached the air. Not a mistake, not a confession, just words that stayed longer than expected. The silence didn't grow stronger. It didn't fade either. It stayed subtle, almost easy to overlook if I chose not to reflect on it. And maybe that was the point. Not everything unsaid disappears. Some words remain, not because they are dramatic, but because they were never released. They don't demand attention. They don't demand resolution. They simply stay, not loudly, not urgently, just steadily. Nothing around me needed to change. Nothing needed to be corrected or revisited for closure. I didn't need to go back to know it was real. I simply continued, aware that there were words inside me that had stayed longer than I expected. What I didn't say stayed longer than expected, and it stayed with me.